I want to lay out a very modest case for the doctrine of purgatory. Now, I'm not going to actually make a positive case for purgatory, and we're not going to look at the Bible. We're not going to look at church documents. We're not going to look at the saints. We're not going to look at arguments against purgatory and answer them. Really not going to do any of that in this video. This is just kind of a preamble, if you will. All I want to do in this video is lay out a case, a way to think about how the doctrine of purgatory is not unreasonable. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a very strong case, and it's not meant to be. I'm not making a positive case for purgatory. I just think that there's a way to approach it to where it's not as unreasonable as often Protestants seem to think it is. And so if we can make this step, then maybe we're more open to looking at the positive evidence from the Catholic point of view. So if you're Protestant watching this video, I would just ask that you would, for a moment, take Martin Luther out of your mind, take John Tetzel out of your mind, remove indulgences and all those things out of your mind, because that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm not answering all that. I'm only going to make a very modest case for why I think the doctrine of purgatory is not unreasonable. And then in a subsequent video, we can make a case for why it's biblical and why it's rooted in solid apostolic tradition. That's for another day. I want to make this case based on one of my favorite Protestant Calvinist teachers of the Bible and teachers of theology, and that is the late, great Dr. R.C. Sproul. Now, many of you are familiar with that name. Dr. Sproul had a large footprint on American Calvinism. In fact, he's often understood to be the one that had the greatest impact on the revival of Calvinism in American evangelicalism. So I was first introduced to Dr. Sproul, not personally, but through his radio ministry, Renewing Your Mind, in 1989, and he very quickly became my favorite teacher. Dr. Norman Geisler had the most direct impact on my life because he was my mentor. I studied theology under him, but Dr. Sproul was always kind of my favorite teacher. And now that they're both no longer around, I feel free to say that without getting in trouble from Dr. Geisler. So Dr. Sproul had a great way of a very captivating way of presenting a topic. He was very good at what he did, and he had a lot of good things to say. And even though he had a lot of misgivings about the Catholic Church, and quite honestly, a lot of misunderstandings, he's famous for saying that the Catholic Church anathematized the gospel at Trent, a lot of false things that he said about the church. But yet he also had a tremendous admiration for much of the tradition, much of the classical tradition. In fact, he was a classical apologist that followed in the footsteps of Thomas Aquinas. That's quite unusual for a Calvinist who usually follows more in the Kantian presuppositional approach to apologetics. So I really love Dr. Sproul, thought he was a fantastic teacher, and I learned a lot from him. And the fact that I'm now back in the Catholic Church does not take away from that or my admiration for him. Well, Dr. Sproul used to talk about, in very negative tones, what he called justification by death. What did Dr. Sproul mean by this? Well, picture a funeral, and what is usually a central part of a funeral is a eulogy. And eulogy means good word. So you're at the funeral service of your Uncle Bobby. And Uncle Bobby was not such a great guy, and you knew this. Uncle Bobby had a drinking problem. He had a gambling problem. He took your car out from you one night and banged it all up, didn't pay for the repairs, didn't even admit that he caused the damage, and he was just not a very good person. Uncle Bobby, unfortunately, because he was also a chain smoker, died at a young age, and so you're at his funeral, and he's being eulogized. In fact, there's very good words spoken over Uncle Bobby that makes you wonder if you're really at the funeral of Mother Teresa. That's what a eulogy is. And this is what Dr. Sproul means by justification by death. That in American evangelicalism, and maybe just more in American religion broadly speaking, Dr. Sproul noticed, and I think it's a very common sense observation, that when it comes to a person's funeral, we don't like to speak ill of the dead. So no matter how bad a person was, no matter how bad their reputation was, everybody knew you were a corrupt businessman, you were an alcoholic that abused your family, abandoned them in need, or perhaps you were just a lawyer. Some of you might get that joke, some of you might not. But no matter what it was that you were in life or were not in life, when it comes to your funeral, you're going to be spoken well of, and you're going to be assumed to be in heaven. You're going to be assumed to be in glory, doing whatever you like to do the most and doing it with all the gusto. And apparently, God is approving of everything that you were and that you are now. This is what he called justification by death, that the mere fact that a person's soul is now separated from their body makes that person right before God. And I think Dr. Sproul was absolutely right to criticize, to condemn this view. We are not justified by death. We're justified by faith. Now, obviously, for the Calvinists, for someone in the Reformed tradition, they would add the word alone. We're not getting into that debate in this video. We can agree with all of our evangelical brothers that we're justified by faith, not by death. And so Dr. Sproul was absolutely right to really rant and rave against this. And he did it often, and I appreciated him doing it. I think that Dr. Sproul's rejection of this false doctrine of justification by death could also be applied in kind of a boomerang fashion, if you will, to his own rejection of the doctrine of purgatory. Now, when I say his own rejection, I don't mean to say that Dr. Sproul was unique amongst Protestants in rejecting the doctrine of purgatory. Obviously, that's not the case. I don't know what the percentage is, but I would say if you remove the Anglicans, probably 95% of Protestants reject the doctrine of purgatory. Certainly within American evangelicalism, the doctrine of purgatory is seen in a very negative light, usually without anything more than kind of a cartoonish, ahistorical understanding of Luther and Tetzel and everything that went on in the early 16th century. Let's just say that Protestants, American evangelicals, reject purgatory, and I think that Dr. Sproul's rejection of justification by death can be used as a way to help us understand why purgatory is not unreasonable. Now, let me say at the outset that the church does not teach anything specific about purgatory being a place or an amount of time. It describes purgatory in terms of it's a process, it's purgation. It is a purgation of all unChristlikeness. So let me explain. Salvation needs to be understood in terms of what we are saved from. Now, we're conditioned often to think that we're saved from eternal separation of God, and that's the biggie. And of course, that's true. We are saved from hell. Jesus, of course, saves us from eternal separation. He desires to unite us to himself and to the Father and to the Spirit. That's the very point of salvation. But salvation is more than just a get out of hell free card. It's more than just a life insurance policy. It's more than just, okay, you don't have to go to that bad place and you get to go to this good place. Salvation is the restoration of the perfect image of the Son in us, which entails the removal of all unChristlikeness. So we could say that salvation is ultimately us being saved from unChristlikeness. So a person, there's a beginning point in this. We all agree with this. Catholics and Protestants agree. There's a beginning point. We disagree in many ways, oftentimes about what constitutes that beginning point, whether it's baptism or some kind of crisis conversion at a later point in life. That's not the point of our video here. We all agree that there's an initial point that we are justified, but that doesn't make you in perfect conformity to Christ. And I don't think anybody disagrees with that. We all recognize that there's a sanctifying process. We might use different terms to describe it, but we refer to this life as a time when God is producing in us holiness. He's making us Christ-like. Now, we may be talking about a person that began this journey early in life, maybe perhaps in their infancy, confirmed later in their teens where they took ownership of their faith, or you may be talking about someone who began this journey on their deathbed or anywhere in between. But along this journey where we are walking with God and we are learning to obey Him, to model our lives after Him, and in fact, that unChristlikeness is being removed from us, much in the way that a sculptor would remove any unwanted marble in order to form the image that he is seeking to produce in that chunk of marble that he started with. That's what God is doing with us, seeking to conform us to the image of His Son, which means removing many things that are not in conformity to His Son, some more than others. So no matter where we are in that process, I think most people would agree that there are a very select few people that any of us could identify that at the point of their departure from this earth, they were perfectly conformed to Christ, such that nothing left was to be done. That at the time that their soul separated from their body, their soul was in perfect conformity to Christ, that there was nothing unholy, nothing unloving, nothing untoward, nothing untrue, nothing not beautiful in their soul. They were in perfect conformity. Most of us would agree, especially if you come from really a Puritan mindset with a focus on our sinfulness. You would have to agree that at the time of our death, there's still work to be done. There's still work undone within us. So if Dr. Sproul could reject justification by death, and rightly so, would those that like him that reject justification by death be willing to reject sanctification by death? In other words, what is quote unquote magical about death that a person who in this life was not perfectly conformed to Christ at their death suddenly became perfectly conformed to Christ? And see, I think that's a preamble to how we can understand purgatory. I think it's not unreasonable at all to assume that maybe there is some kind of process that occurs between the time of our death and the time of our appearance before God. I'm using the word time, not really meaning time. This is for lack of a better way to describe it. That there is a process between the moment of our death and the moment of our being gifted the beatific vision, in which that purification is completed. That's what the church calls purgatory, a process of purgation. And I think if you can reject justification by death, I think you should also be able to reject sanctification by death, which means that you should at least be open to the evidence that the church lays out for the doctrine of purgatory. Well, I hope that was helpful. I think it's a modest argument. Again, I'm not trying to prove purgatory. I'm just trying to show that there's a way to understand it as not being an unreasonable doctrine just made up by a medieval church that was seeking to control people and their finances. No, it fits well even within a Calvinist or an evangelical understanding of the Christian life. That sometime between our death and our appearance before God, something has to happen in order to make us perfectly fit to see God and to behold His beauty face to face. Well, until next time, may the Lord bless us, protect us from all evil, and bring us to everlasting life. Amen.